the characteristics of language. And in part, this discussion is going to include characteristics of other communication systems. But you'll see as we go through this list that there are characteristics that language as a communication system has that are not shared by other animals' communication systems, which is why we distinguish it from what they do. One question that we had a student asked last time, when I asked people what question comes to mind as you look at this film, tell me what it made you think of with regard to language. One student said, I don't understand why we study animals' communication systems if they don't have language. What's the point? And the point is that there are characteristics that overlap, and it's possible, in fact, likely, that language as a communication system built upon mechanisms that were used for communication systems of other species. And for that reason, we can learn about fundamental mechanisms of language as a communication system by looking at communication systems that may be distantly related to it. Just like we can learn about the human body by studying species that aren't our own, right? We can learn about how our brains work, we can learn about how our organs work, we can learn about, how we process fat. I mean, we have lots of researchers here who study lots of other kinds of animals trying to understand biological mechanisms that influence us. And so one thing we're going to look at today are these different characteristics, and I'd like you to think about which ones are unique to language and which ones we can find examples of, we can think of examples of in animal communication systems. Now, when I asked you guys on the first day what you thought language was, pretty much everybody said it's a way to communicate, right? And that's true. Language is a way to share information. And there are lots of species who share information with each other, with other species. So sharing information is not in and of itself enough to make something a language. We can talk about mode of communication and how do I share information? And we have identified three primary ways that organisms share information with other members of their species and with other organisms. The first of these, which is the one that we use primarily for language, and that other organisms use too, is a vocal auditory mode of communication. So vocal obviously has to do with the vocal tract producing sound, and then that sound is received by the ears. We have an auditory mechanism that picks it up, it's taken in, and then processed. Then the individual who heard the message comes up with their own message and produces their own vocal emission, and that is heard by the other organism. So we have this vocal auditory means of communication. We also have a gestural visual mode of communication, and people who use a vocal auditory mode may use a gestural visual mode as a supplement, right? Watch, I'm standing here doing this thing, I make facial expressions, I do that. So we can use multiple modes of communication in parallel to supplement each other. And there are times when maybe I can't use my vocal auditory mode, I might use just my gestural visual mode, like you can't see, because I can't say that out loud, so it's kind of like, so you see this out on the highway all the time, right? You see people in the cars, they know you can't hear them, but they're still very enthusiastic with their gesturing. Now, this is because we have so much manual dexterity, and because we have reasonably good visual systems, some human beings have taken this as their primary mode of communication, and this often occurs when they are unable to use the vocal auditory mode of communication. So if they are mute, or if they are deaf, or some combination thereof, then they may sign instead of speaking with their voice, and that's still language, right? That doesn't prevent it from being language. So language is not restricted to just a vocal auditory mode. You can have a gestural visual language, and it can be a complete language because it has other characteristics that we're going to talk about. The third mode of communication that's much more common to animal communication and less sophisticated message sending is a chemical olfactory mode. So this is where chemicals are secreted by the body and the messages are received by the olfactory system or the nose. Now, obviously, we use that form of communication too. If we didn't, the perfume and cologne counter at Macy's would not be so popular, right? People spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars every year getting the soap that smells good, and the shampoo that smells good, and putting on the deodorant so they continue to smell good even when they're doing other things, right? So we're sensitive to smells, and those smells can send messages, but we're not typically using them as a primary mode of communication. This is very different from, say, what dogs do. Okay? Dogs do use a chemical olfactory mode of communication to communicate with others. So when you take your dog for a walk, and your dog, we talk about how my dog is checking her pee mail, right? She's walking down the street smelling all the bushes. What she's doing is picking up her mail from all the other dogs who've been walking down the street. They've been saying, I'm here, and I'm bigger, and I'm tougher, and then she has to leave her reply, right? And then other dogs will come down the street and leave their message, and so there's these layers of messages down the street that the dogs are picking up so they know who's in the neighborhood, if there's any new big bad alpha dog in the neighborhood they need to worry about, or if they're, whatever. So other creatures do this too. And some animals will leave secretions from their eyes on trees, other kinds of things to indicate that they're in the area so other animals will know. They secrete hormones and other things to let other members of their species know they're available for mating, which is actually not unlike what's happening at the Macy's counter. But so this is, we do this too. We layer that on top. But the olfactory chemical mode of communication is not as sophisticated, not as detailed, because it doesn't allow for some of these other characteristics, which we'll talk about now. So we have to have a mode of communication. And in language, we tend to use the top two. Next, language and other communication systems have pragmatic function, meaning that the messages that are created through the mode of communication have a purpose. So there's an intent behind sending the message. Now, we make vocal, auditory emissions and receptions that don't have any purpose. If I yawn and go, I made a sound, but I'm not necessarily intending to send any kind of message, right? I can make noises that don't mean anything. But when we're communicating, the use of that mode of communication has a purpose. I'm intending to share some piece of information that I have with maybe specifically you, or maybe just whoever might be around, right? When the lions roar at the zoo near my house, they're letting people know they're big, they're scary, and you need to back off, right? And that's part of they're sending that message. They don't know that I'm jogging by the zoo at that time, necessarily, unless they have really good hearing, but they're sending a message kind of claiming their territory. Okay, so that's a pragmatic function. Pragmatics has to do with how we use something as a tool. And human beings use language as a tool to take ideas from our own head and transfer them into the heads of others. And that's our primary means of doing that. So if the messages generated by the system serve a particular purpose, I have a particular meaning I want to send, and I'm going to use this particular message to send this particular meaning, then you're talking about pragmatic function. Now, the reason that language and other communication systems can have pragmatic function is because they have a characteristic called semanticity. Now, semanticity has to do with a particular message corresponding to a particular meaning. So in English, if I say the combination of sounds, if I say k right before ah, right before t, and generate the word cat, and then I ask everybody in this room to draw a picture of the image that just came into their head, what do you think would happen? What?
I'll draw the same.
You'd all pretty much draw the same thing, right? What would you draw?
Cat.
A cat, right? What would it look like?
Cat.
What does that mean? Would it have ears? Would they be big floppy ears?
Triangle.
Little triangle ears?